In the warm days of June 1949, Mao cabled one of his top commanders, General Su Yu of the Third Army, and asked him a crucial question. What are the issues or problems related to seizing Taiwan? From 1949 into 1950, the Chinese Communist Party and its army, the PLA, planned for the invasion of Taiwan, 100 miles off the Chinese mainland. Mao Zedong, the party's leader, felt that with the liberation of Taiwan, they would bring to a close 100 years of turmoil. It was the one last push, the one last thing that had to be done. But here was the problem. Invading and defeating armies on Taiwan would be exponentially more difficult than defeating armies on the Chinese mainland. Invading and conquering the island would require a lot of troops and a way to get those troops across 100 miles of choppy water. At the same time, the enemy, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist forces, wouldn't be sitting around idly either. At the time of his retreat, he still had aerial and naval superiority, and would be able to bombard any transport force and drown troops before they could even touch land. So going back to Mao's request back in June, what are the issues or problems related to seizing Taiwan? Su Yu, 2 months later, replied with 4 preconditions. 1. The army had to be ready to cross the Taiwan Strait. 2. The navy had to be ready to move army soldiers across the strait. 3. Guaranteed air coverage to protect those troops. And 4. Cooperation by defected nationalist agents or planted communist spies. The cost of ignoring these preconditions was made crystal clear on the island of Kinmen, an island just 4 miles off the Chinese mainland. The PLA had ignored many red flags, bungled the landing of the invading force, had their boats destroyed, and in the end lost 9,000 soldiers. Mao called it the worst loss of the Civil War. The point was reinforced a week later with another loss at the smaller Dengbu Island for essentially the same reasons. More preparations would be needed. The invasion of Taiwan was set in the not-so-distant future, about 1 to 2 years away, and China went about a massive scaling of its naval and aerial forces to meet that deadline. To start off with, China had about 25 ships who defected from the nationalist forces in 1949, in addition to whatever they had seized as the war swung more to their favor. It wasn't enough. So China invested a lot into building boats, big and small. Big boats to take troops across the strait, and then small boats to deliver the troops to the beach itself, because the terrain was not friendly enough for the big boats to directly land on the beaches. Whenever possible, they tried to buy naval transports as well. Much of it came from the Soviets, financed by a $300 million loan. But also some older boats made in America and Japan were seized as well. On the air front, the PLA had seized nearly 350 planes from the nationalist forces, but not all of them were in ready condition, nor did they have pilots ready to fly them. Stalin sold to China nearly 1,000 airplanes from 1949 to 1950 and also agreed to send a delegation to train pilots to fly those airplanes. The goal was to gain aerial superiority over the nationalist forces within a year. In 1949, a naval academy and a number of flight schools were established to train thousands of sailors and airmen. The first pilots and air combat units graduated in the summer of 1950. By the end of 1950, the plan was to have 900 pilots and 400 fighters, of a quality superior to those of the nationalist troops. It seemed like the plans were going well, and China was on pace to achieve their goals, aerial and naval superiority over the nationalists. The Taiwan campaign, at first set in 1949, was reset to summer 1951. Training would begin in July 1950. But as time progressed, the final campaign just kept getting bigger and bigger. What already started out as something monstrously ambitious blew up again and again in scale. The first major turning point was in May 1950, when 200,000 PLA soldiers conquered the island of Hainan. The nationalists lost 30,000 troops out of their 120,000 strong army. It was a smashing success for the PLA after the embarrassing loss at Kinmen, especially considering that Hainan was also an island, and an encouraging sign of progress made towards the invasion of Taiwan itself. However, victory was not total. the Nationalists were able to evacuate some 70 to 90,000 troops back to Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek then decided to evacuate many of the islands, Kinmen being a notable exception, and move those troops to Taiwan itself. 120,000 were moved from Zhoushan Island, which the PLA had been prepping to attack too. This was a huge setback. The PLA's original invasion plans had been counting on those troops being on the offshore islands, where they could have been easily annihilated there. Now there would be 400,000 nationalist troops waiting for the PLA on Taiwan, with another 100,000 soon to be trained and deployed. More soldiers would need to be allocated to the Taiwan invasion. The PLA revised its plans. Now 16 armies were to go to Taiwan, over 1 million individual soldiers. It was estimated to take nearly 2,000 boats to transport them across the island. By this time, nearly a third of China's total military capabilities had been mobilized for this campaign. It would have been epic, but it never happened. The main reason was the Korean War. In June 1950, North Korea invaded the South, and the US ordered the 7th Fleet to enter the Taiwan Strait and neutralize things until the end of the Korean War. One of China's top officials reported to the CCP Central Committee that, quote, "The changed situation increases difficulties in our plan to attack Taiwan because the US is now standing there. However, it is not a bad thing because we have not completed our preparations," end quote. The Nationalists had not been standing still. Throughout 1950, Chiang Kai-shek bombed naval vessels and shipyards, including the 25 which defected in the previous year. He also purged a large number of officials on the island, removing communist infiltrators and sympathizers. Between this and the new presence of the 7th Fleet, it would have been more than enough to warrant a re-evaluation. But beyond that too, it had to be acknowledged, and they did, that the PLA fell short of its task of mobilizing enough troops, naval, and aerial capacity to realize its insanely ambitious plan to invade Taiwan. For example, by mid-1950, China produced some 50 combat vessels, 50 landing vehicles, and 30 auxiliary vessels for about 43,000 tons. Sounds impressive, but the Nationalists had about 100,000 plus to defend with, and a 2,000 ship 16 army invasion plan called for over 760,000 tons. In addition, an amphibious campaign is immensely complex, requiring tight cooperation between all divisions of the armed forces, and the PLA just wasn't ready. The campaign was postponed to 1952, and then when the Korean War escalated and China entered that war, Mao moved the bulk of the PLA north towards the border and told the troops who remained to switch from an offensive position to a defensive one in case of a re-invasion from Chiang Kai-shek. This final failed campaign for the invasion of Taiwan set the foundations for today's complicated set of affairs between Taiwan and the mainland.